Well, the next couple of weeks are big weeks for Maven. We will be holding our 5th annual Maven Conference here in Southern California, and we hope to see many of you there. Now, typically at the beginning or prior to each Maven Conference, we've hosted a Thursday night event because the Maven Conference goes Friday night, Saturday. And so on Thursday nights, we've done some special events. And last year, we did an event with some of the speakers at the conference, and it was entitled The New Normal, The Consequences of Rethinking the Family. And really looking at all of these challenges to the family in our current culture, whether it's cohabitation, whether it's divorce, whether it's reproductive technologies, whether it's same-sex marriage. There are a lot of things that are coming at us fast and furious. And how do we navigate all that? And so we thought it would be really helpful to take that Thursday night event and really use that for our podcast for these next 2 weeks, because obviously it relates to what we want to do here at the Maven Parent Podcast.
Yeah, so we hope this will kind of whet your appetite for what you can hear and learn if you come to the Maven Conference. Also, if you can't come to Southern California for our conference this year, there is a live stream option. So go to our website, mavenconferences.com, and pay for the live stream and do that if you can. If you can't come to California, we'd much rather see you in person. So this is last year's pre-conference event, and this first clip that we'll play is Brett's talk and John Stonestreet's talk, and it was all under the topic, like you said, about the new normal of families. So here is Brett and John's talk from last year.
I am Erin Kunkle.
I'm Sarah Stonestreet.
And we are co-hosts on the Strong Women podcast that we do through the Colson Center. I also partner with, I'm also with Maven. My husband and I started Maven 4 years ago. So I kind of wear 2 hats this weekend.
You wear more than 2 hats, though.
Actually, that's true. I wear a lot of hats. So we have come together as Strong Women Podcast, Colson Center, Maven, and also them before us for a really important topic on the new normal, the consequences of rethinking the family. And I think all of us would agree that we are feeling the weight of the different slogans in our culture that are being tossed around. When Sarah and I were thinking about slogans, we thought about one that is often thrown around, like, love makes a family. What does that mean? Love makes a family. And then what does that do to our idea of the family if it's just made of love? And also that children just need loving parents. That's all that they need. So it doesn't matter if they're same-sex parents or just co-parenting parents. Co-parenting, that's a new slogan in the culture. And actually just this week, CNN commentator Van Jones announced that his daughter was born through a friend that they agreed to co-parent together. And they plan to stay friends, to live apart, but to share this child. And his quote was this, when they asked about his decision to enter into a co-parenting relationship, he said this. He said, so we decided to join forces and become conscious co-parents. It's a concept that I hope will move people to explore and consider. So he's not just saying, hey, this is what we decided to do. He's actually hoping that this spurs on more of us to try this new idea of co-parenting. And of course, one of the other lies Sarah and I came up with too is that the kids will be fine. Whatever we adults do, the kids are going to be fine. They're resilient. They're bounce back.
Yeah, and as we were thinking about this topic, if you think about this, in our culture, the common and the most widely spread narrative right now is that we can construct whatever we want, whatever makes us happy, whatever organization of family that we want to call family, we can just construct it. And the same is true with identity and gender and all of this stuff. But if you step back and think about this for a minute, it's really the difference between recognizing that we have a creator and our identity and family is not created by us. It's not a construction that we can just come up with. It's already been designed. And so if you come at it, like if there's not a creator, then it actually makes a lot of sense. Love is love. You know, children will be fine. Like the family can be whatever we want it to be, because if there's nobody designing it, well, then that makes sense. And actually some of these lies have seeped into the church, because as you all know, when we're swimming in cultural waters, the narrative gets adopted because that's what we're swimming in, right? And so we want to take this night and step back. As T.S. Eliot said, before you know what to do with something, you need to ask, what is this for? And I don't know about you guys, but I feel like sometimes I get in a conversation with someone that's coming from a different perspective on this and that has totally drank this Kool-Aid of, you know, constructing their own identity or constructing their own family. And I'm kind of frozen. Do you guys feel that? Like you're just kind of frozen? I don't know what direction to go with. I don't know how to approach this conversation. And so that's one thing we're prayerful about in this conversation tonight, is that this will be an opportunity for us as Christians and you all watching online to just take out this topic. Let's lay it on the table and say, first of all, what's the big picture? Why is this important, and how can we talk about this in a thoughtful and winsome way? And so that's kind of our hope for the evening.
Yeah. Okay, so just to give you an idea of what's ahead. So we have 3 different speakers tonight, so we're going to hear about 3 different specific topics underneath this big picture. And then we're going to do a Q&A time with all the speakers, and Sarah and I will join them up here, and we'll do some Q&A and interaction with the talks that they've given. So first we're going to start with, we're going to hear from Brett Kunkle, who I know pretty well, on the topic of developing a Christian worldview. So we're going to start with the big topic of worldview.
Wait, did you tell the live stream audience that that's your husband?
Oh, yeah, it's my husband.
Okay.
I was going to get that, but I should be clear.
Yeah.
Okay, so Brett is the founder and president of Maven, which he started with his lovely wife, Erin, 4 years ago.
The better half.
The way better.
Way better.
If we do say so ourselves. He is fluent in sarcasm and still loves living in California, surprisingly, despite the mass exodus from the state by most of our friends.
Which you should exit, I think.
I know.
Sorry,
well,
California
Sarah's from
people,
Colorado.
Don't you think? Oh, they're saying no. Okay. Okay, sorry.
Okay, and then our next speaker will be?
Yeah, next speaker is my husband, John Stonestreet, also fluent in sarcasm. And I'm also his lovely wife. But John is going to talk to us about that question that I was just mentioning with T.S. Eliot. We're going to step back. What is marriage for? Big picture. He's not going to tell you how to do marriage, because we are both very much learning how to do marriage after 19 years, growing and loving each other better each year. And so we're not doing that. He's not doing the how-to, but kind of the big picture. And John and I live in Colorado, and we have 4 kids that are here. That's the mini one right there. Hunter, wave to everybody. There he is. He's famous. And then I've got daughters spread out. Abigail's back there. And anyway, so we have 4 kids.
Okay, and then our last speaker is Katie Faust, and she's going to talk to us about the new family and what's happening in the culture and how we can think about it. So Katie, if you don't know her, you are in for a treat. She is the founder and director of Them Before Us, which is made up of ordinary adults who are committed to putting the needs of children at the forefront of the battle surrounding the very foundation of our society, marriage and family. She is a heroic voice in the fight to defend children and their most basic rights in a culture that has a disordered view of their needs and the value of children. She is married to her husband, Ryan, and they've been married 23 years, and they have 4 kids as well. And then, as I say, we will bring everybody up and do questions. So we're going to give you the number to text in for questions. So live stream listeners and audience, get a pin out, and we're going to give you the number to text in questions. And actually, at the end of the night, we're going to give away some books from our speakers, and we're going to choose from people who sent in questions. So that's a motivator right there. Okay.
And if you don't have questions, then Aaron and I will just keep talking and asking all of our questions. So there's motivation too.
Okay, so the number to text your questions, ready, is 626-869-8525. 626-869-8525. Okay, without further ado, our first speaker, Brett Kunkle.
I was getting a little concerned with that introduction there. I was thinking the Stonestreets and the Kunkles are probably going to need some marital counseling if that intro goes too much further. Hey, glad that you're here tonight. What I want to do is kind of frame our conversation tonight. In particular, looking at this issue of family. Now, in 2016, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Obergefell versus Hodges that there was a requirement for all states to issue same-sex marriage license, right? Well, 2 years prior to that decision, conservative columnist Rod Dreher wrote an article called Sex After Christianity, and I would encourage you to do a search for that article. It's entitled Sex After Christianity, and Rod Dreher. Read that article because Rod touches on something before this decision went down that really gets to the heart of what is at issue when it comes to things like same-sex marriage. And this is what Rod said in that article. He said, gay marriage is not just a social revolution, but a cosmological one. Too many Christians think that same-sex marriage is merely a question of sexual ethics. They fail to see that gay marriage and the concomitant collapse of marriage among poor and working-class heterosexuals makes perfect sense given the autonomous individualism sacralized by modernity and embraced by contemporary culture, indeed by many who call themselves Christians. They are fighting the culture war moralistically, not cosmologically. They have not only lost the culture, but unless they understand the nature of the fight and change their strategy to fight cosmologically, within a few generations, they may also lose their religion. So what is Dreher saying here? He's saying this is not merely a moral issue. This is not merely an ethical issue. It runs deeper. It's a cosmological one. What does he mean? Well, he's really getting at this idea that this is a worldview issue. The issue of same-sex marriage and the larger issue of family and marriage that we're going to talk about tonight these are worldview issues. And what we need to do in the church as followers of Christ is to be able to think about these things worldviewishly. All right. Now, what do we mean by a worldview? A worldview is simply our story of reality, right? Or our picture of reality. What that means is that Christianity, it's not just a story that's a kind of a nice bedtime story that we like to tell and pass along. No, this is actually a true story, or I think maybe a more accurate way to describe it is that it's an account of reality. Christianity is a worldview, and a worldview is an account of reality. It's an account of the nature of reality. Now, what does a worldview do for us? Well, I want you to imagine maybe the typical American mind. All right, and in the typical American mind, we hold all sorts of different beliefs and ideas. And I want you to imagine that each belief and idea that you hold is represented as a kind of a puzzle piece, okay? And so if you were to dump out the contents of the mind of the typical American out onto a table, and the beliefs were puzzle pieces, most American minds would look something like this, wouldn't they? Kind of a scattered, disconnected, jumbled mess of different beliefs. And when we think worldviewishly, what a worldview can help do is it can help take and bring coherence to all of those puzzle pieces. It takes those beliefs and attempts to fit them together, right? And as you put together puzzle pieces, they eventually will begin to form a coherent whole, right? That's what a worldview does for us. It begins to put together a coherent picture of reality. Now, think about this puzzle analogy. Imagine you're doing a puzzle. What are two things that can happen if you're putting together a puzzle that can really derail your little time of putting together that puzzle? Right? Number one, if you have missing pieces. So if you are missing pieces, you get down to the last couple pieces and you realize, you put them in place and you realize, I'm missing 2 or 3 or 4 pieces. That is absolutely frustrating, isn't it? And it doesn't give you that full picture. In the same way, by thinking worldviewishly, what it can help reveal, number one, is whether or not we've got some missing pieces. We've got some missing pieces in our account of reality. But then what's the second thing that can happen that can derail your puzzle? If you have pieces from a different puzzle, right? So you've got another piece. And of course, if you have young kids who have done puzzles and then you've trusted your kids to put away those puzzles, what ends up happening is the next time you get that out, you've got other pieces from other puzzles in there. And that can be frustrating when you're trying to fit this piece that doesn't actually fit in that piece of the puzzle or in that puzzle. In the same way, thinking worldviewishly can help us identify pieces in our puzzle that don't actually fit. Right? Have you ever maybe engaged with a Christian friend on a particular issue and you were kind of surprised by the fact that they affirmed a position you felt or you thought was not a biblical view, right? They had a puzzle piece that didn't fit in the Christian puzzle, in the Christian worldview. Okay, now, with a puzzle, think about it. When you dump all those pieces out and you want to start to organize that puzzle, where do you start in a puzzle? You start with the corners, don't you? You start with the edges. Now, why do you do that? Because when you start to put together the edges and the corners, what that will do is it will create a frame that will then make sense of all of the other pieces that you're going to put into that puzzle. And when you have that frame, it makes it easier to start putting those other pieces in, right? Imagine identifying like a piece of the puzzle that was in the center, and then you started with the center piece and then tried to build your way out. How much more difficult would that be, if not impossible? And throughout that process, you'd probably be putting, wrong pieces together. But we start by framing the puzzle, don't we? Well, in the same way, that's what a worldview can do, and particularly the Christian worldview. We often go running to these different issues, right? And so whether they are issues of sexuality or education or work or social issues, technology, morality, parenting, you name it. We often will say, well, how do I approach this issue? Or what's the right thing to think about, when it comes to this issue? And we will approach those issues as individual puzzle pieces. And no wonder so many Christians struggle to deal with all that we have to deal with in the culture. Right? Because often we're dealing with those pieces in isolation from the larger framework. And so what we need to do is we need to think carefully about the larger framework And in particular, that framework is made up of very significant questions. And I just want to quickly identify 5 of those significant questions. In fact, John and I outline these questions in our book, A Practical Guide to Culture, right? These questions will frame every puzzle piece that we encounter. What are those questions? It's the question of, number 1, origin, right? A worldview, if it's going to give us an adequate account of the nature of reality, it's going to have to answer this question. Where do we come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? Not only do you have origin, but then you have identity, right? What does it mean to be human? Who am I? What am I? And think about where our culture is at on this one. We can't even answer what it means to be human. We can't even answer what it means to be male or female. And of course, if you don't know what it means to be human, then you certainly can't get human flourishing correct, can you? And we see the results. And now notice there's a flow from origin into identity. How you answer the origin question will largely shape how you answer that identity question. Not only do we have the identity question, we have the question of meaning. Why am I here? What is the purpose of all this? Is there a purpose to all this? Is there something that's some kind of transcendent meaning, or is this just something I build into my own life based upon my own desires or my own preferences? There's the question of morality, right? How should I live my life? In fact, our culture even questions the whole notion of a should, right? And then lastly, destiny. Okay, when this short life is over, what happens when I die? Is there a part of me that survives the death of my body? Or is the story over at that point? And so notice those 5 questions create a larger framework by which we can make sense of all of the particular puzzle pieces. And so we're looking at tonight this puzzle piece of family, right? And so we're going to see different offerings from the culture, different things that the culture is going to say about the nature of this puzzle piece. And so, for instance, the things that we're going to highlight tonight are not just things that are somehow on the fringe. The radical revisioning of the family is not just something that's on the fringe. What we see this is gone mainstream. In fact, I'm going to show you a little video clip, about a minute video clip from a video of a children's program called Blue's Clues. How many of you are familiar with Blue's Clues? Right? Blue's Clues is mainstream. And what is the age demographic that the creators of Blue's Clues are after? They're after kind of 2 to 5-year-olds. And this past last year, during the summer, during Pride Month, they put out this video to help us understand that family really can be anything we want it to be.
Hey, Blue, look at all these families. Hi, families. It's time for a pride parade.
Families marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah. Families marching one by one, hurrah, hurrah. This family has 2 mommies, they love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big parade. Families marching 2 by 2, hurrah, hurrah. Families marching 2 by 2, hurrah, hurrah. This family has 2 daddies, they love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big parade. Come on, friends! Families marching 3 by 3, hurrah, hurrah. Families marching 3 by 3, hurrah, hurrah. These Babas are non-binary, they love each other so proudly, and they all go marching in the big parade.
Okay, that video actually counts all the way to 10, so you're welcome that we cut that a little short. But you get a picture, right? What's being offered here for that 2 to 5-year-old audience? A vision of the family. Here's what the family can be. It can actually be, it can be anything you want it to be. right? This puzzle piece, you get to create that puzzle piece. And there's no larger framework that it fits in, right? And because in the secular culture, we've actually done away with much of that framework. And so you have something like this. This is just yesterday, Dave Rubin, who considers himself a classical liberal, but many conservatives, those who are political conservatives, consider Dave Rubin an ally, and he is on important issues. But yesterday he tweeted out this picture saying, it's true, all of it. What's true? That he and his same-sex partner are having 2 children. Right now, obviously, as 2 biological males, they're not able to have those children. So how are they having those children? And so there was a host of congratulations from conservative voices on this. What do you have? You have the puzzle piece of family being made however we want to shape it. Now, of course, that's okay if there's no framework, and this is why Christians must think worldviewishly. That puzzle piece, in fact, I think this is one of the most important things we can do for the next generation, is give them that framework, because often we talk to them about these issues in isolation from that larger framework. And when we do that, it loses coherence to a younger generation. It doesn't make sense. Why can't 2 people who love each other and who are consenting adults, why can't they form a family? Right? And so we have to put it in terms of that larger framework. And so we've got to go back to that question of origin. Our answer to family starts with that question of origin, that God is the one who makes us. Right? And we go right back to Genesis 1, and in Genesis 1, what do we find? We find, number 1, that God creates, Genesis 1:1. He creates, but not only does he creates human beings in particular. He creates humanity, and he not only creates humanity, but he creates humanity in his image. Not only does he make them in his image, but he then makes them male and female. And at the end of that, what does he say? It's good. And that's where we start as Christians when we think about family. Now, how do we know what God says on this? Well, obviously, my appeal to Scripture would be one. We know what God says based on his word, but we also can look into God's world and we discover knowledge about him. We discover knowledge about the nature of reality. We discover knowledge about the nature of family. And so that's what we want to do tonight. We want to appeal to both revelations. Not only to Scripture, but as Christians, what we're going to have to learn how to do in a increasingly secular culture is we're going to have to learn how to appeal to the nature of reality, to God's world, in order to advance our arguments. And we have a couple of great guests here that are going to help us with that as well. So before I bring John up, I just want to make sure that we understand what's at stake. And I think a lot of Christians do now. I think what we've seen in the last few years of the culture has begun to wake a lot of those of us in the church. It has begun to wake us up, right? And one thing that John and I write in the Practical Guide to Culture is this idea, right, that ideas have consequences, but there's a flip side to that. The ideas that we hold have consequences, but the bad ideas, the false ideas that we hold also have victims. And this is why we need to get family and marriage and parenting and children right. Because if we don't, we are going to see an increasing brokenness and harm in the culture. And so with that, I want to invite up my friend John to talk to us about particularly marriage. John?
Thanks, Brett. Brett's absolutely right when we talk about marriage, to pull it back to a worldview issue. I oftentimes refer people to that article that Brett started with from my friend Rod Dreher, that article, Sex After Christianity. And I'm with Brett. I think you should go find that and read that. Now, obviously, with a title like that, you need to Google carefully. But Sex After Christianity, because the fundamental point here is that the biggest shifts that we have seen in our culture over the last several decades have not been moral shifts. It's not that there haven't been moral shifts. Of course there have been moral shifts. In other words, things that were once considered wrong are now considered right, and things that were once considered right are now considered wrong. What Dreher is arguing there is that the moral shifts that we have seen over the last several decades, where we've changed our minds even on fundamental things about what is right and what is wrong, that has not been the root, that's been the fruit. There's been a deeper shift that's created the moral shift. The cosmological shift that Dreher puts out, and I would even specify it a little bit, the cosmological shift has taken the form primarily of, ready, an anthropological shift. Now, I know that's a whole lot of big words in a short amount of time for a Thursday night when March Madness is on. And I do want to publicly thank Brett for holding this event during the tournament. But what I mean by an anthropological shift is that our culture has fundamentally changed its mind on what it means to be human. Who are we as human beings? What does it mean, not just as male or female, but what gives us value, what gives us dignity? And this is expressed in marriage. And I think that the fundamental thing that we have seen with marriage, the worldview shift that we've seen in marriage, is that we tend to think about marriage as a speed limit, not like gravity. We tend to think about marriage as if it's a speed limit, not gravity. Let me tell you what I mean. A speed limit is something that people come up with in order to govern the traffic on a particular road. And if things change, for example, we have cars with better braking technology, or we add another lane to the road, or maybe there's a school that's put there on the side of the road, then we can change the speed limit in order to accommodate what it is that has changed. In other words, speed limits are social constructs. They don't exist in reality. They're things that we come up with in order to help us live together. Does that make sense? And that's really what we've done with marriage. We've taken something like marriage and we've said, you know what? Let's decide that marriage isn't permanent and that people can enter it when they want and also leave when they want. And let's expand marriage, not only so that it includes a man and a woman, but that it includes two men or two women. And of course, now the argument is going even further to say, let's expand it. Because look, if it's not connected, for example, to one man and one woman because of their ability to have children, well, then it doesn't matter how many. And so now we have initiatives to change marriage from being just about couples to also being extended to more than just two people. This is called polyamory. This is the next inevitable thing on the slippery slope, I think. If two people can love each other and love makes a family, as the slogan was thrown out earlier, then why can't three people or four people? Why does it have to be a couple? Why not a throuple or a quadruple or a quintuple? Why can't we all get together? And let's also change marriage in all kinds of other ways. I know, let's come up with something else that's a whole lot like marriage, and let's just call it marriage even if it's not. And so that's been one of the features over the last several decades, not only same-sex marriage and no-fault divorce, but also cohabitation. I've got good news and bad news. The good news is fewer people are getting divorced than ever. The bad news is fewer people are getting married up front. Because in other words, we look at something like cohabitation, and you hear people say things. Talk about slogans. This is one of those slogans that you hear, right? It doesn't matter if two people get married. All that matters is that they live together and fill in the blank. Love each other. It's like you've heard this before. Okay, so in other words, this is what we've done with marriage. Things have changed. We're a different people. We have different understandings of this or that or the other. So let's tweak marriage around the edges to make it work for us. We've treated marriage as if it's a speed limit. Does that make sense? You can't do that to gravity. Gravity is not a social construct. You can't decide one day that, as a culture, we have decided that when you jump off the roof, we are going to go up instead of down. And we're going to pass laws this way. In other words, it doesn't matter if you try to socially construct gravity, gravity always wins. And this is really the fundamental question, that's the fundamental worldview question that is at the heart of how we're thinking about marriage. Is marriage a speed limit or is marriage gravity? Is marriage a social construct, something that we've come up with together in order to order our lives together, or is marriage gravity? That no matter what we call it, no matter what we try to do to it, no matter what we try to do to change it, it is what it is. Right? There's a line from the late Dallas Willard. He said, you can't step off the roof and then choose not to hit the ground. That's the way gravity is. Now, I think there is a strong case to be made that marriage is like gravity, not like a speed limit. Now, obviously, we can make that case from Scripture, and I'm going to get there in just a second. But here's the thing about the Bible. When we say the Bible is true, what we don't mean is that the Bible is true for me but not for you. What we mean is that whether you believe it or not, the Bible is what? True. It's just true. It's the best account of reality that actually exists. So if the Bible teaches that marriage is like gravity, built into the fabric of the universe by God at creation, which I'm going to come back to here in just a second, then shouldn't we be able to find evidence of that in the world around us? Does that make sense? So before we go to Scripture, let me just say this. I think there's more than two, but let me give you two really compelling reasons why marriage is more like gravity than it is like a speed limit. Does that make sense? You see where I'm going here? Okay, here's the first reason. The first reason or the first compelling argument, I think, that suggests that marriage is more like a gravity than like a speed limit is, you can look back through history and you can find the first culture or the first society or the first civilization that came up with written law, that decided that the law that was going to govern the people isn't going to be just the kind of the command of the king or the emperor or the czar or the ruler, but that actually we're going to write this down. You can find which society gave us written law. You can find out which society, invented the idea of kind of a court of law, like an adjudication so that people can get justice. You can go back and you can find which culture gave us the first written language. You can find which culture gave us the first a whole lot of things. But sociologists and anthropologists have looked back in history and they've tried to figure out which society first came up with marriage. Which society first came up with this idea that a man and a woman could set themselves off as an independent unit and then be responsible for the children under them, and that this would actually be a way that we order our lives together. And you know what? They can't find which society came up with it. You see marriage across human history. You see it in Christian cultures, religious cultures, cultures that kind of came out of the Jewish tradition. You see marriage in pagan cultures. You see marriage across the board. In other words, it's almost like it's always been there. Maybe because it has always been there. You can't find which society gave us marriage. And I think there's three fundamental realities that make sense of why we can't figure out which society gave us marriage for the first time. Three fundamental things. Ready? Here we go. Number one, sex makes babies. I know that's really deep. Do you need some time to write that down? Okay, sex makes babies. Number two, society needs babies. Why does society need babies? Well, I've got bad news. The mortality rate is 100%. Everybody dies. So if you're going to have a future as a society, you need what? You need babies. And number three, babies need a mom and a dad. Now that's something that has largely been taken for granted throughout every civilization, Christian and non-Christian, until now. And that's where Katie's going to go next, about this idea suddenly that we're questioning that whether babies need a mom and a dad. But no matter if you're religious or non-religious, no matter if you're an ancient culture or a modern day culture, no matter if you have the internet or don't have the internet, those three things are still true. And because those three things are still true about the human experience, guess what? In every culture, you find some form of marriage. Wasn't fully identical. The only real aberration to kind of the traditional one man, one woman is a polygamist arrangement. That was pretty common in other places. Fascinating. That was always one man and many women, never the reverse, which tells us something. I'm not saying, by the way, that's a good idea. I'm just saying that that's the only sort of alternative arrangement that you find. Does that make sense? Are you guys with me on that? Okay, so the first reason that we have to suggest that marriage is more like a gravity than like a speed limit is that it's in every culture that we can find. The second thing that I think is really compelling is there is a direct correlation between the health of marriage and family and the prosperity of society. Now, there's a couple of different ways to look at this. One way is to kind of get down on the ground and look at the data. And there's remarkable data about this. If you want a website that tracks all this data, there's a data that was born out of the Heritage Foundation called Family Facts. It's familyfacts.org. If there has been a study or a research project done in some sort of correlative relationship between marriage, parenting, and the ongoing relationship that it has to culture, like, for example, which kids are more likely to get in trouble at school, which kids are more likely to be successful in life, all of that sort of correlative stuff, it's at Family Facts. The other way to look at it, though, is not kind of on-the-ground details about like incarceration rates and GDP and things like that, but to get up at the 30,000-foot view. And this was something that a sociologist named Joseph Unwin did back in the 30s. Joseph Unwin looked at 100 different cultures, civilizations that we had record of. And he wanted to know which cultures, what made cultures tick? What could you learn about them? He looked at cultures that would be considered, at the time, civilized cultures. Some cultures he called uncivilized cultures. This was back in the 30s when you were able to say things like that in anthropology. Like, for example, if people ate their neighbors instead of loved them, that sort of stuff. And so he looked at all these civilizations, and here's what he found. It's fascinating. He found that cultures that had a strong control over the sexual appetite through marriage were more productive and prosperous. But cultures in which the sexual appetite was run rampant were less productive and less prosperous. Isn't that a fascinating thing? Here's the thing. Sex is like fire. That's true for individuals, and that's true for societies. When a fire is in the fireplace, it brings light, it brings heat, it brings warmth and ambiance and things like that. When the fire jumps out of the fireplace onto the curtains, now suddenly what was supposed to bring light and life brings what? Darkness and death. Apparently, what Unwin found looking at the history of civilization is that marriage was to sex what the fireplace is to the fire. It's the context that takes this very, very powerful thing and turns it toward good cultural ends rather than destructive ones. So you see that marriage exists across time, across civilizations, across cultures, and every time and place we know of. And there's a direct correlation between marriage and the health of society. In other words, it seems like marriage is baked into reality like gravity. The problem is we have been treating it as if it's a speed limit. The difference between those two things is dramatic. My wife mentioned earlier a guy named T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot was just a brilliant writer and thinker on areas of culture and education. And in an article on education once, T.S. Eliot said something really fascinating. And I'm going to paraphrase it because we kind of have to work through the quote. But basically what he said is, whenever you come across something that you don't know about or you've never seen before, two questions come to mind. The first question is, what can this thing do? Or what can I do with this thing? And the second question is, what is it for? And the point of his quote was to ask which of those two questions, what can I do with this, or what is it for, has to be asked first. How would you answer it? Which of those two questions is the most important question to answer first? What can I do with this, or what is it for? Let's say I've never seen a laptop before. Brett, is this your laptop? Okay, good. Let's say I've never seen a laptop before, and I'm like, this is really weird. I wonder what I can do with this. I can open and close it. I could have a puppet show with this. Now, can you have a puppet show with a laptop? Sure. It just would be dramatically underutilizing the laptop. Unless it's a Dell, then it's okay. Or let's say that it's kind of smooth and flat, This is kind of one of those hipster cool MacBook Pros. I bet I could skip this across that lake. Now, can you skip a laptop across the lake? Theoretically, you probably can. But if you do it, not only are you underutilizing the laptop, you're actually going to end up what? Destroying it. So before I know what to do with the laptop, I need to know what is the laptop what? Before I decide to expand marriage, before I decide to prematurely end marriage, before I decide to come up with a substitute and call it marriage, I need to know what marriage is what? For. But if you treat marriage like a speed limit, like a social construct, there's no for in the equation to begin with. Almost everything that we are dealing with on a worldview level in our culture has to do with whether this world is designed and created by God, or whether our beliefs and our views of ourselves and our identity and our social institutions like marriage are constructed. Almost everything flows from that distinction. Does that make sense? There's a brilliant passage here as I close that shows that Jesus thought this same way about marriage. In Matthew chapter 19, a group of Pharisees come to Jesus and they're trying to trip him up. And they ask him a question about divorce. Moses said we could get divorced. Do you think, Jesus, it's okay for us to get divorced whenever we want to? It's fascinating that he's talking here to teachers of the Jewish law. He's considered to be a teacher of the Jewish law or a rabbi. So you have a legal question from legal scholars to someone else about the Jewish law. Fascinating. Is it okay to do this with marriage, is the question. And when Jesus gets that question in the Jewish context about the Jewish law from rabbis teaching about the Jewish law, instead of answering from the Jewish law, Jesus says, well, wait a minute, don't you know what was intended by God for marriage from the very what? He takes them back beyond the law to what? Creation. And then he actually goes in and describes the creation. That God created them male and female. And what God has joined together, let no man set apart. And just trust me, this is such a loaded passage. We completely miss what Jesus is doing here. And especially when you go back and look at the context of what's happening when God creates Eve and gives Eve to Adam as his helper. You realize that when God gave Eve to Adam as the helper, it was in the midst of God giving Adam a job to do. Do you remember what the job was that Adam was supposed to do? What was he supposed to do? Name the animals. We often think like these are two stories. In Genesis chapter 2, you can check it out, it's the same story. God's created the world. As Brett says, he looks at everything that he has made and he said, this is good. And then in Genesis 2, before the fall, God looks at what he has made and says, something's not good. What's not good? That man is lonely, so I'm going to make him someone to keep him company? Is that what it says? No. It's not good that man is what? I'm not going to create a companion for him. I'm going to create a what? A helper for him. Why does Adam need help? Why is it not good that he's alone? What did God tell Adam to do? Be what? Fruitful. That's going to be hard. He's going to need some help. And so what does God say? Hey, go name the animals. So you can see this all take place, right? Like there's Mr. Aardvark, Mrs. Aardvark. There's Mr. Giraffe, Mrs. Giraffe. There's Mr. Tapeworm, Mrs. Tapeworm. Like he's naming all the animals. And then what's the conclusion of this whole job? It's so beautiful how this happens. Of all the beasts and creatures of the field, not a single helper was found that was suitable for him. I remember reading that thinking, wait a minute, animals are super helpful. They pull our plow. They give us coats. They give us tasty bacon. Like animals are awesome. He didn't need any help. He needed what kind of help? Suitable help. Guess what? Another Adam would not have been suitable help. Another Eve would not have been suitable help for Eve. When those Pharisees come to Jesus and say, hey, is it okay to divorce for any reason? Jesus said, don't you know what was true from the very beginning? In other words, in order to ask what we should do with marriage, let's look back at what marriage is for. that God created them male and female, and the two shall become one, what? Flesh. That there was actually something in the design of God for male and female, something in the suitable helper. This isn't just an emotional commitment. Marriage is actually built into the fabric of the world from creation by God to take his image bearers, male and female, and send them on a trajectory to a human future that he himself is directing, eventually will enter himself in the form of Christ Jesus, God the Son, in order to establish the kingdom which will go on forever and ever. Does this make sense? Marriage is not just something that humans made up. Marriage is something that God made up. So we can have ideas about marriage that are different than his, but they're going to have consequences. And the bad ideas about marriage are going to have victims. Does that make sense? Now, I want to bring up Katie Faust here. I'm so excited that you guys get to hear. Nobody is doing more right now to showcase and highlight and bring attention to the most important and most victimized victims of our redefinition of human beings, sexuality, and marriage, and that is children.
Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.